What if a normal driveway was hiding something no one was ever meant to find? Stay with us to uncover a story buried in silence for many years. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe and hit like. What's coming next will leave you speechless. Harold Jenkins had lived alone on Maplewood Street in Cedar Falls, Ohio for nearly 2 years now. His wife Margaret had passed quietly one autumn evening, and since then the house had grown too silent for comfort. The ticking of the kitchen clock echoed louder than it ever had, and sometimes he would turn on the television just to drown out the quiet. He wasn't one for company anymore. Not really, though his neighbor Tom Wilkins often checked in on him, usually under the pretense of borrowing tools he already owned. At 78, Harold still took pride in doing things himself. He fixed what broke, mowed the lawn, and kept his old workshop clean. He didn't like asking for help. It made him feel old. So, when he noticed a long crack spreading through the concrete of his driveway after a week of heavy rain, he decided it was something he could handle on his own. The rain had been nonstop that week, soaking the ground and turning lawns into soft, spongy patches. By Friday, the sky had finally cleared, and the afternoon sun dried the wet pavement enough for Harold to work. He fetched his shovel, gloves, and a small tool set from the shed. As he began scraping away at the cracked section of his driveway, he muttered to himself about how water always found its way into places it shouldn't. His plan was simple. Dig around the damaged spot, see if a root or broken pipe was the cause, and patch the concrete later. He worked slowly, pausing often to catch his breath. The dirt underneath was soft and heavy from the rain, sticking to the shovel in clumps. A few times he stopped to rest his back, leaning on the handle and wiping sweat from his forehead. As he dug deeper, he noticed something strange. The soil began to sound different. His shovel struck something that gave off a dull metallic thud. At first, he thought it must be an old pipe from the 1950s construction, maybe part of the original plumbing. But when he cleared more of the dirt away, the object didn't look like a pipe at all. It was flat, solid, and wide. Harold crouched down, brushing the mud aside with his hands. Beneath the grime, he saw a thick slab of metal pitted and rusted with age. His fingers traced its edge, and he realized it had corners, right angles, and what looked like a large rusted hinge buried along one side. He sat back on his heels, heart beating faster. This wasn't a pipe. It was a door. For a long moment, Harold just stared at it, unsure of what to do next. The idea of finding something hidden under his own driveway was scary, almost silly. He tried to remember anything unusual about the property, but he'd lived here for 40 years, and nothing like this had ever come up. There had been no strange noises, no signs of tunnels or basement, just an ordinary suburban home built after the war. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. He grabbed his small crowbar from the shed and returned to the hole. As he pried at the rusted edges, flakes of old metal broke off, leaving a reddish dust on his hands. The door was thick, far thicker than any storm shelter or storage hatch he'd ever seen. He tried to lift it, but it didn't budge. He could feel something heavy pressing down from the other side, sealing it shut for decades. Evening light was fading now, turning the yard a dim shade of gold. Harold stood there, breathing hard, staring at the metal door half buried in the earth. He didn't know what he had found, but every instinct told him it wasn't something meant to be opened by a man with a crowbar. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked toward his neighbor's house. Tom's truck was in the driveway. Maybe, he thought, it wouldn't hurt to have another pair of hands. He glanced back at the mysterious hatch one last time, its outline faintly visible through the dirt, and felt a strange chill run through him. There was something about it. Its weight, its silence. That felt old. Older than the house. Older than the street. The kind of thing that should have stayed buried. Still, Harold was a man who didn't like leaving questions unanswered. Tomorrow, he decided he'd get Tom to help him open it. Tonight, he would cover the hole with a tarp and try not to think too hard about what might be waiting beneath his driveway. But as he walked back to the house, the thought stayed with him, quiet and persistent, like a whisper just under the surface of his mind. Some things are buried for a reason. The next morning dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with leftover humidity from the night's drizzle. Harold Jenkins stood by the hole in his driveway, coffee mug in hand, staring down at the rusty slab of metal. He hadn't slept well. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that dark outline beneath the dirt. Part of him told himself to leave it alone, to call someone from the city and let them deal with it. But another part, stronger and more stubborn, whispered that it was his property and his problem. By mid-morning, curiosity won. He walked across the yard to his neighbor's house and knocked on the screen door. Tom Wilkins, tall and broad-shouldered despite being past 70, answered with a grin and a towel slung over his shoulder. Harold explained what he'd found, trying to sound calm, even though he could feel the excitement in his voice. Tom raised an eyebrow, chuckled, and said, "You sure it's not an old septic tank?" But when he saw the look on Harold's face, he grabbed his gloves and followed him over. The two men stood over the half-exposed door for a long moment. The metal surface was dull and scarred, a relic from another time. Tom crouched beside it, rapped it with his knuckles, and frowned at the hollow sound. "That's no pipe," he said. "Looks like a hatch. Maybe a storm shelter." Harold shook his head. "Not like any I've seen." They fetched crowbars from the shed, scraping away layers of packed earth and stones. Each movement sent small clouds of rust into the air. The door had no visible handle, only a pair of heavy hinges so rusted they looked fused to the frame. As they worked, the air around them grew colder, and the smell of wet iron filled their lungs. After nearly an hour, they found a recessed groove near one edge, a latch of some kind. Tom wedged his crowbar into the gap and leaned on it with all his weight. The latch gave a sharp groan, but didn't move. Harold joined him, and together they heaved until the metal shrieked like an animal in pain. With one final pull, the door broke free of the ground, the hinges giving way with a violent crack. Dust and stale air rushed out, carrying a faint metallic stench. Both men stepped back, coughing. The dark opening below them gaped like a wound in the earth. A narrow staircase led down, swallowed by blackness. The concrete walls were slick with moisture, and somewhere far below came the faint sound of water dripping. Tom shone his phone's flashlight into the darkness, but it barely reached the bottom. "Jesus," he muttered. "How deep does it go?" Harold didn't answer. He felt something scary, a pull, a sense that whatever lay below had been waiting a long time. "Maybe it's some kind of shelter," Tom said again. But even he didn't sound convinced. "We should call the city. Let someone check it out." Harold hesitated. Logic told him Tom was right, but curiosity burned too fiercely now. He had to know. "I'll just take a quick look," Harold said quietly, as though saying it too loudly would make it dangerous. He retrieved a flashlight from his garage, a heavy-duty one he used for power outages. Tom frowned, but followed as Harold knelt beside the hatch. The beam of light pierced the darkness, revealing damp steps descending into what looked like a corridor. Harold's breath fogged in the cool air. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and took the first step. The metal stairs creaked under his weight. Each footfall echoed in the confined space, amplifying the sound until it felt like someone else was walking behind him. The air grew colder as he descended, carrying the musty scent of decay and iron. When he reached the bottom, he saw a narrow tunnel stretching ahead, lined with old, riveted steel. Water dripped from the ceiling, forming small puddles that mirrored the flashlight's beam. Tom's voice floated down from above. "You see anything?" Harold swallowed, his throat dry. "Looks like storage, maybe," he called back, though the truth was he couldn't tell yet. He took a few cautious steps forward, the beam of light revealing outlines in the shadows. Large shapes stacked neatly against the walls. Crates, dozens of them, all coated in grime and dust, marked with faded symbols he couldn't read. A chill ran down his spine. Whatever this place was, it had been sealed away for decades, untouched by anyone living. He turned slowly, feeling the weight of the air pressing around him, and a sudden, instinctive fear told him to stop. "Harold!" Tom's voice echoed again, sharper this time. Harold looked up toward the opening above, the beam of his flashlight shaking slightly. "I think I found something," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Something old." The words lingered in the damp air like a secret finally unearthed. He took one last look at the endless rows of crates, then turned and hurried back toward the stairs, his heart thudding. When he reached the surface, he drew in a long breath of fresh air and shut off his flashlight. The sky had turned pale and still. Tom looked at him, waiting for an explanation. But Harold just shook his head. "We need to call someone," he said quietly. "Something's down there, and it shouldn't be." The police arrived within 20 minutes, their flashing lights painting the quiet suburban street in red and blue. Harold stood near his mailbox, his hands trembling slightly as he explained what he had found to the first officer on the scene. Tom stayed beside him, arms folded, his expression grim. The officers listened, glanced at the open hatch, and called for backup. Within the hour, 2 more patrol cars and a fire truck blocked the road, and the area was sealed off with yellow tape. Neighbors began to gather at a distance, whispering among themselves, wondering what could be so serious about an old metal door under a driveway. Harold tried not to listen. He kept his eyes on the ground, feeling the weight of something heavy in his chest. When the officers asked him to wait inside, he refused. Whatever was under his house, he wanted to see it through. A team of specialists arrived soon after, their uniforms marked with insignias Harold didn't recognize. One of them, a man in his 40s, with a calm but cautious demeanor, introduced himself as Captain Russell from the local bomb disposal unit. "You did the right thing calling us," he said after hearing Harold's story. "From what you described, it could be an old military installation. We'll need to take a look before we can say anything for sure." He motioned for his team to approach the opening. They wore heavy gloves and carried equipment that looked both sophisticated and scary serious. Harold watched as they descended carefully into the darkness he had entered only hours earlier. Minutes passed like hours. The faint sound of voices echoed up from the stairwell, muffled and tense. Then one of the technicians emerged, speaking quickly into his radio. Captain Russell's face hardened as he listened. He turned toward Harold and Tom, his voice quiet but firm. "We're evacuating the area immediately. There are munitions down there, real ones." The words hit Harold like a physical blow. "You mean explosives?" he asked, his voice unsteady. Russell nodded. "Old military ordnance. A lot of it. They're unstable and dangerous. We'll have to clear everyone within 2 blocks." As officers went door to door, instructing families to leave their homes, Harold stood motionless. The thought that beneath his feet lay live bombs decades old and decaying was almost impossible to comprehend. His mind flickered through memories of his life in that house. The summer cookouts with Margaret. The nights he sat on the porch watching storms roll in. The laughter of neighborhood kids riding bikes past his driveway. All that time there had been death lying just beneath them, waiting in silence. He felt sick. Tom put a hand on his shoulder. "You couldn't have known, Harold," he said softly. "Nobody could have." The sun dipped low as the evacuation continued. News vans began to arrive, their cameras trained on the flashing lights and uniform teams. The once quiet street now hummed with controlled chaos, voices over radios, the rumble of vehicles, the measured urgency of men who knew how to handle danger. Harold was guided to a safe distance where he stood beside a paramedic van, watching as the bomb squad worked. Floodlights illuminated the driveway, turning night into a pale imitation of day. The hatch stood open, surrounded by cables and tools. He could see the technicians moving methodically below, careful with every step. Hours passed. The cold evening air bit through Harold's jacket, but he barely noticed. At some point, Captain Russell approached again. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his voice weary but steady. "We found a large cache of explosives, probably left from World War II. Looks like this area might have been used as a temporary storage site back then. For some reason, it was sealed off and forgotten." Harold stared at him, unable to speak. "They're volatile," Russell continued. "We'll have to remove them one by one. It's going to take all night." Tom offered to drive Harold to a hotel, but he refused. "I'm not leaving," Harold said quietly. "This is my home. I'll stay until it's over." The captain didn't argue. He simply nodded and walked away, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts. He sat on the curb, watching as the men worked to unearth the past. His driveway now a portal into another era. Somewhere deep down, he felt a grim sort of connection to it all. Time had buried those bombs just as it had buried his own years of love and loss, waiting for someone to dig them up again. Near midnight, a sudden command echoed through the night. "Hold position." Every movement stopped. Harold's breath caught. For several seconds, no one spoke. Then one of the technicians climbed out of the hatch, holding something carefully wrapped in protective cloth. He handed it to another officer who placed it into a reinforced container. Captain Russell exhaled audibly. "That's one," he said. "Dozens more to go." The words sent a chill through everyone present. Harold looked up at the stars, faint beyond the glare of the floodlights. His heart ached, not from fear, but from an overwhelming awareness of how fragile everything was. The bombs had slept undisturbed for 80 years, and it had taken one old man's cracked driveway to wake them. He wondered how many other forgotten things the earth still held. How many secrets lay buried beneath the lawns and streets of quiet towns like his. The night carried on full of quiet urgency, and Harold remained there, silent and small, beneath the weight of history stirring under his feet. By morning, the entire neighborhood had transformed into a controlled zone. Police barricades sealed every road, and bomb disposal trucks lined the street like silent sentinels. The hum of generators filled the air as men in protective suits moved carefully between vehicles, coordinating through radios. Harold Jenkins stood behind the safety perimeter with a wool blanket draped over his shoulders, his tired eyes fixed on the driveway that no longer looked like his own. What had once been a quiet suburban yard was now a field of flashing lights, flood lamps, and shadows of men dismantling history piece by piece. The cold bit through his clothes, but he barely noticed. He hadn't slept, couldn't eat, and every time someone shouted an instruction or the ground shook slightly, his heart jumped. Around him, evacuated families waited in groups, some crying softly, others staring in stunned silence at the chaos that had descended upon their peaceful street. Tom Wilkins appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. His face looked drawn, his usual humor replaced by quiet concern. "They said it might take another day," he said, handing Harold a cup. Harold nodded absently, his fingers shaking slightly as he accepted it. The steam rose between them, curling into the cold morning air. "You should go rest somewhere warm," Tom added. "This isn't your fault." Harold stared ahead, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It's my driveway, Tom. My house. If something happens, it happens to me first." Tom sighed and didn't argue. They both knew Harold wasn't leaving. A few feet away, Captain Russell stood speaking to a small group of technicians. Harold could tell by their expressions that the situation wasn't simple. When the captain approached later, his tone was grave but steady. "We found over 30 crates so far," he explained. "Most contain high explosive shells and anti-tank munitions. They were likely stored here near the end of the war. Some are intact, but a few are corroded and unstable. We have to move slowly. One wrong vibration could trigger a chain reaction." Harold's stomach turned. "How long?" he asked. Russell hesitated. "As long as it takes. We can't risk rushing it." He gave Harold a brief, reassuring nod before returning to his team. As the day wore on, tension spread through the crowd like static. Every sound seemed amplified. The hiss of air compressors, the faint rumble of engines, the clatter of tools. Reporters had gathered at the end of the street, their cameras pointing toward Harold's home. News anchors spoke into microphones about the hidden war relic beneath an Ohio suburb. Hearing it described like that, his home turned into a headline, made something tighten in Harold's chest. Margaret had always loved their quiet life. The way the street bloomed in spring and smelled of cut grass in summer. Now it smelled like diesel and metal and fear. In the late afternoon, as the technicians worked inside the hatch, one of them called out suddenly. A collective stillness spread through the site. Harold could see them forming a perimeter, moving with careful urgency. Captain Russell barked a command, and everyone within a certain distance was moved back another 50 yards. Tom gripped Harold's arm, guiding him behind the barricade. "Something's unstable," Russell shouted to his team, his voice echoing through the cool air. The tension stretched into minutes that felt like hours. Every pair of eyes was fixed on the open hole in the ground. The sound of cautious movement echoed from below. Then silence. Finally, a voice came over the radio. "The device is secure." The crowd exhaled in relief, the kind that leaves your body trembling afterward. That night, Harold was taken to a temporary shelter in the community center. Rows of cots lined the gymnasium, filled with neighbors he'd known for decades, but never seen look so frightened. Children slept against their parents, and the murmur of hushed conversations filled the air. Tom sat beside Harold, both men staring at the dark windows. "You think they'll get it all?" Tom asked quietly. Harold rubbed his hands together, his voice low. "I don't know. Maybe some things aren't meant to be found." The next morning, he insisted on returning to the site. Captain Russell met him at the barricade, fatigue etched deep into his features. "We're nearly done," he said. "Most of the munitions are out. The rest will be detonated safely off-site." He paused before adding, "You and your neighbors can go home soon." Harold nodded, though the word home felt strange now. His house no longer seemed like the same place. By evening, the last of the bombs had been removed. The sun dipped below the horizon as the final truck pulled away, its red tail lights fading into the distance. The noise subsided, and for the first time in days, silence returned to Maplewood Street. Harold walked toward his yard. The hole had been filled, smoothed over with clean soil, the surface still damp from the rain. There was no trace of the metal door, or the horror it had contained, only a faint rectangular outline where the earth had been disturbed. He stood there for a long time, feeling both relief and an ache he couldn't quite name. Tom joined him, his voice soft. "You saved this neighborhood, Harold. If that rain hadn't cracked your driveway, no one would have known." Harold gave a faint, weary smile. "Maybe," he said quietly, staring at the ground where it had all begun. "But sometimes I think the ground was trying to tell me something. Maybe it just couldn't hold it anymore." The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of damp soil and smoke. Above them, the sky was clear again, the stars beginning to show. For the first time in days, the world felt still, as if exhaling after holding its breath too long. But deep inside, Harold knew the calm wasn't quite peace. It was simply the silence that comes after chaos, a silence that listens. The following days passed in a quiet haze. The barricades were gone. The news crews had left, and the once bustling street had returned to its ordinary rhythm. Children played on the sidewalks again, though their laughter carried a nervous edge, and adults still spoke in lowered voices when passing Harold Jenkins's house. The air smelled of wet dirt and new concrete. Workers had come and gone, pouring fresh pavement over the spot where the hatch had been, smoothing it until no trace remained. To any stranger, it was just another driveway in a peaceful neighborhood. But Harold couldn't look at it without feeling the weight of what had been buried beneath. He spent that morning sitting on his porch with a cup of black coffee, watching the sunlight creep across the yard. His body ached from exhaustion, though he hadn't lifted a tool in days. He wasn't sure what to do now that it was over. For decades, his life had been predictable: gardening, repairs, quiet dinners with Margaret, and the comforting sameness of each passing season. Then, in 1 week, the earth itself had cracked open and shown him something he couldn't forget. The ground beneath his feet had been keeping secrets, and he wondered how many others lay hidden under the calm surface of everyday life. Tom Wilkins stopped by around noon, carrying a box of donuts, and that same familiar concern etched across his face. He sat beside Harold, handing him one without a word. For a while, they just ate in silence, listening to the wind rustle through the maple trees that lined the street. Finally, Tom spoke. "The city says they're done. No more danger. You can sleep easy now." Harold nodded but didn't answer. He was grateful, yes, but there was a heaviness in his chest that relief couldn't touch. "You know," Tom continued, "you probably saved this whole block. If you hadn't started digging, none of us would have known." Harold looked at him, his expression unreadable. "I didn't save anyone, Tom," he said quietly. "I just woke something up. It was the ground that decided to let go." That night, after Tom had gone home, Harold walked down the driveway alone. The concrete gleamed faintly under the porch light. He crouched and touched the surface, feeling its cool smoothness under his fingers. For a moment, he imagined the hollow space beneath, now filled and sealed forever. It was strange to think that only a few feet below, death had waited for nearly 80 years, silent and patient. He wondered about the man who had built that bunker, the soldiers who had stored those weapons, and the people who had forgotten it all. Every generation leaves something buried behind. Sometimes love, sometimes regret, sometimes danger. A light breeze carried the smell of rain from somewhere far off. Harold straightened slowly and looked around at the houses, their windows glowing warmly in the dusk. Life was returning to normal. Children would ride bikes again over this new stretch of pavement, never knowing what once lay beneath. Maybe that was for the best. The past had been put to rest, sealed and quiet once more. Yet part of Harold felt connected to it now, as if he had shared a secret with the earth itself. He walked to the end of his driveway and stopped, gazing at the patch of grass where Margaret used to plant her lilies. They would bloom again in the spring. He thought maybe he'd plant something new there, something that would remind him not of what was lost, but of what endured. As he turned to head back toward the house, His gaze lingered one last time on the smooth, unbroken concrete. He whispered softly, more to the silence than to himself, "Guess I finally fixed that crack." The words hung in the air for a moment before fading into the hum of the evening. The world around him was still, peaceful, ordinary once again. But as Harold stepped onto his porch and closed the door behind him, the faint echo of the past seemed to settle into the ground, deep and permanent, like a memory the earth would keep long after everyone else forgot. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but others always find their way back to the surface. If this story made you think, let us know where you're watching from. Hit like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves a good mystery.